Welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about the fundamental demographic crisis that Russia is now encountering and the problems that this is causing in terms of workforce and lack of bodies. This data has just been released, which shows the number of work permits that Russia issued in 2025, broken down by country. And this chart dates back to 2017. And you can see we've got a number of different colours here. So we'll just run through the colours from bottom to top. At the bottom in black, we've got China, followed by the pink section, which is India. Turkmenistan is the grey section. Vietnam, the light blue section. Bangladesh, the yellow section. Sri Lanka, the green section, and then everybody else, the blue section at the top. So if we look at the general trend here, back in 2017, Russia issued around about 150,000 work permits to overseas workers. And the majority of that was coming from other countries. So basically, the countries that were surrounding Russia who were very keen to come into Russia and work. Now, if you look at what's happened between 2017 and 2020, there was a massive reduction in the number of work permits. And obviously, 2020 was the year that was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. But if we look at what's happened since 2021, when we came out of the pandemic, there has been an increase in the number of work permits. But by 2023, it was still sitting at a level below 2017. But in 2024 and 2025, we've seen a sharp increase. And in 25, 240,000 work permits were issued to overseas workers, which is an increase of almost 50% compared with where Russia was before the war in Ukraine started. And if we look at the breakdown of which countries Russia is issuing those work permits to, the biggest single country is China, 92,000 issued last year, followed by India, 56,000, Turkmenistan, 25,000, Vietnam, 23.5, and then we've got Bangladesh at 9,400 and Sri Lanka, 3,600. So it's interesting that Russia's two biggest trading partners, China and India, are now the two countries where Russia is looking to recruit the most workers from. And of course, the reason why Russia is doing this is because it's got a shortage of people. It doesn't have enough workforce to fill all of the jobs, and that's causing major problems in the economy. So the big question is 240,000 overseas workers enough to fill the gap for Russia? And also, what's going to happen going forward with regards to the broken relationship between India and Russia now that India has said that it's no longer going to buy Russian oil and it's getting much closer to the USA in order to reduce the tariffs that are being applied to Indian exports. So I thought it was worth having a look at some of the data just to see what's going on here. Now, if I have a look at this chart, which regular viewers of the channel will be familiar with, it's the population pyramid for Russia. And the population pyramid basically splits out the population of any country into 5-year age groups. So you've got 0 to 4 at the bottom, then 5 to 9, all the way up to 100 plus. And there are two different colours here. On the left-hand side, we've got the male population, and on the right-hand side, we've got the female population. So males are in blue, females are in pink, roughly speaking. And what you can see here is that Russia has a declining population. So the biggest single age group is 36 to 39. That's basically when Russia peaked in terms of expanding its population. But in every single age group below that, we've got a declining number. So Russia has a narrowing population pyramid. In fact, it's not a pyramid at all. It pretty much looks like a cylinder now. But the key issue here is that the birth rate has been falling whilst the death rate has been rising. And that means that Russia now has a declining population. And also, if we look at the split between male and female, you can see that there are a lot more females in Russia than there are males. And there's two reasons for that. The first one is the wars that Russia has been involved with has basically led to the loss of life of male civilians. And secondly, there's also a lifestyle problem in Russia in terms of alcoholism and poor living standards, and that's leading to the loss of life of males more than females. So we've got an unbalanced population in terms of age. Russia has an aging population, but also there are a lot more women than there are men. And the problem, well, one of the problems that Russia has is it has a relatively low retirement age. So it's actually got around about 20 to 25% of its population are now retired. And that's going to put further burden onto the workforce. And if we have a look at what's going on with regards to unemployment, you'll have seen this chart recently. Russia has seen a huge reduction in unemployment over the past 5 years. Since the war in Ukraine started, it's come down significantly. And currently, unemployment levels are running at around 2.2%, which isn't good news. Normally, you might think low unemployment equals healthy economy because everybody's in employment. But the reason why Russia has such low levels of unemployment is that it simply doesn't have enough people to fill all of the vacancies. So there's very little unemployment. Lots of people have jobs, but that's still meaning that there's lots of unfilled vacancies because there aren't enough bodies. That's one of the reasons why Russia has now started issuing work permits to countries like China and India to try and bring more people into the country. But because of the war in Ukraine, Russia isn't really a very attractive country to move to. It's not like it is in the USA, where it really doesn't matter what's going on with the birth and the death rate because you've got the option of immigration. You can allow in lots of people from other countries if you need to boost the total population. That's more difficult in Russia because not a lot of people want to move to Russia right now. And if we have a look at what's going on with the birth and the death rate, this is the fundamental problem that Russia now has. This chart shows the difference between the birth rate and the death rate dating back to 1990. So the zero line sort of towards the top of this chart would indicate equilibrium. So births and deaths equal each other. So you'd have a stable population. But if the death rate is more than the birth rate, then you've got a declining population. And what you can see here is that in 1990, the year before the Soviet Union broke up, the birth rate was actually higher than the death rate. And that meant an increase in the population. So we've got a positive figure above that zero line in 1990. In 1991, we had a slight increase in the population because the birth rate was still above the death rate. But that's the year that the Soviet Union collapsed. And that led to a lot of uncertainty. It led to major economic problems in the economy. And people were worried about what was going to happen. And so there was a huge reduction in the birth rate and an increase in the death rate. And since that time, we have seen a decline in the population. There was a slight blip in the early 2010s, but you can see that over the last 35 years, the population in Russia has been coming down as a result of the fact that the death rate outstripped the birth rate. And we have a quick look at what's happened over the past few years. In 2025, the birth rate in Russia was 10.89 people per thousand of population, and that was actually a 2% decline against 2024. Now, interestingly, the 2024 figure represented an increase, and there's two reasons for that. Firstly, there were a lot of initiatives in Russia to try to increase the birth rate, so people were encouraged to have more children. But also, because of the declining population and the fact that a lot of people fled the country due to the war in Ukraine, we've got a smaller percentage of people having babies against a smaller population, and so it sort of distorted the figures. If we have a look at what's happened with the death rate in Russia in 2025 was 13.17. If we just compare that to the birth rate of 10.89, that means that on average, 2.5 people per thousand are dying when you look at the net difference between the birth rate and the death rate. So this is a fundamental problem that Russia is now facing, that it's not producing enough people, therefore its population is in decline. But at the same time as this is happening, we've also got a lot of emigration. So a lot of people, around over 1 million people, have left Russia since the start of the war in Ukraine because they didn't want to be conscripted. So that's adding further pressure to the problem between the birth rate and the death rate. If we have a look at the chart for the birth rates, I thought this was interesting. This dates back to 1950. So the birth rate in Russia per thousand people was 27.65 in 1950. So that was huge. And we compare that to the death rate in the same year of 1950, it was coming in at 12.26. So there was a huge 15 people difference. So on average, per thousand people, 15 extras were being added every year in 1950. If we now look at the birth rate in 2025 of 10.89, that's significantly lower. And actually, if we look back in 2023, it was down to around 9 per 1,000. And if we look at the death rate for the same period, the death rate now is 13.17. So you can see that we've seen a huge reduction in births per thousand in Russia over the past 75 years, and a huge increase in deaths. And that is a fundamental problem. And if we look at the actual population itself, in 2018, that was the highest that we've seen since the breakup of the Soviet Union. The population got up to just under 147 million people. But since 2018, there has been a year on year decline. Every single year, we've seen the number of people reducing. But if we look at what's happened since 2022, when the war in Ukraine started, there was a huge increase, a 0.5% decrease in the population, followed by 0.6% in 23, 0.5% again in 24, and 0.6% in 25. So over the past 4 years, we've seen the population coming down by more than 2%. And if this trend continues, which it will, because births are still short of deaths, then Russia is constantly going to see a reduction in the number of people in its workforce. And that's a major problem when you're trying to build up your GDP. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Russia converted itself to a wartime economy a couple of years ago. So lots of companies are now being sponsored directly by the Kremlin. Those companies are being given the golden ticket. They don't have to worry about marketing and developing new products and all the things that a normal company would worry about, because they're on a guaranteed payment from the Kremlin as long as they deliver whatever it is that's needed for the war in Ukraine. Those companies have been pushing up wages in Russia because of this shortage of people. They've had to advertise more wages to try and get people to switch jobs. That has been happening. So all of those wartime economy companies have full employment, but that stripped people out of the other companies. So commercial companies in Russia are now short of bodies. They're trying to bring in people from overseas, but because of the combination of the demographic crisis and people leaving the country because they don't want to be conscripted, they're finding it very difficult to actually fill those vacancies. And that's leading to wage spirals, inflation, and shortages of staff. And what we're now seeing coming through in the economy is that this is hitting GDP because Russia can't keep funding the deficit that it's creating every year. So it can't keep paying all of those companies to keep the war in Ukraine going forever without taking on more debt, which Russia is now considering, but who's going to buy that debt? So we've got a major fundamental problem in the Russian economy. And in order to fix its GDP crisis, GDP growth in 2025 was recently announced at 1%, which is considerably less than the 4.1% seen in 23 and 24. Russia needs to start building up its economy, its manufacturing, its actual businesses. But without enough people to fill all of the vacancies, it's not going to be able to do that. Russia can keep funding the wartime economy from its gold reserves, but it needs to actually build up its real economy. And its real economy has been significantly damaged by the war in Ukraine and the sanctions, and now this lack of workforce. So I wanted to make this video really to make you aware that Russia has been reaching out to lots of other countries like China and India and Turkmenistan to try to get people to come to Russia to fill the job vacancies. But that 240,000 of work permits issued in 2025 is nowhere near enough to offset the reduction in the workforce as a result of the differential between the birth rate and the death rate. And also, we're seeing people leaving the country because they don't want to hang around and run the risk of being sent to Ukraine. And also, the retirement age in Russia is still relatively low. So we've got an aging, retired population that need to be supported by the state. In order to do that, Russia needs GDP to be growing so that it can take more tax from those companies and then pay everybody. But unfortunately, GDP is not growing anywhere near as rapidly as it needs to. And the lack of bodies is going to cause major problems for Russia over the next 5 to 10 years. The Labour minister recently came out and said that Russia needs another 11 million workers by 2030. Well, it's not going to get them from its own resources because the death rate is higher than the birth rate. So we've got a declining population. And unless it can persuade millions of people to start moving to Russia, Russia is going to hit a workflow crisis. It's not going to have enough people to fill all of the jobs, and that will lead to a spiral downwards in GDP. So I want to make this video really to make you aware of the fact that even though Russia is getting by and it's managing to deliver some growth in GDP, it's got fundamental flaws now in terms of the number of people to fill all of the vacancies. And it's going backwards in terms of trying to grow itself out of this problem. So this is going to be a very difficult situation for Russia to fix. Even if the war in Ukraine ended tomorrow, I don't think a lot of people would be queuing up to move to Russia. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Chinese and Indian immigrants, whether or not they're allowed to go to Russia. If India does stand by and say that it's no longer going to buy Russian oil, it might decide that it doesn't want to send any people as well. So we've got some major problems that Russia is now facing. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already.